The reunion had been looming for weeks, yet every time I tried to talk about it with Ronan, his responses were clipped, disinterested. He barely masked his irritation whenever I brought it up. I should have known better than to push him. Should have known that my enthusiasm for these family gatherings wouldn't land well with him. But I had a stupid hope clinging inside me that if we could just get away from the house, away from the to-do lists and the silence that had gotten so thick between us, maybe we could find a sliver of what we used to have. I needed it to work. For too long we'd been walking around each other like ghosts, barely acknowledging the other's presence except in shallow conversation about bills or what was for dinner. He hadn't touched me in, God, I couldn't even remember when the drift had started. Slow and steady, like erosion, bit by bit until the physical side of things vanished altogether, and we were left with this cold shell of a marriage. Ronan didn't even look at me when I told him the official date for the reunion. His eyes stayed glued to the screen in front of him, the phone lighting up his face with that blue tint that made him look more distant than usual. Just a simple nod, and then back to whatever article was more interesting than me at the moment. I sighed and let it go, too tired to confront any of it. It wasn't that I didn't feel the resentment simmering beneath the surface. I did. It was always there, a constant prickling at the back of my mind, but confrontation hadn't worked in the past, so why pretend it changed things now? When the day finally arrived, we drove in silence for most of the way, the occasional forced comment about traffic or the weather filling the gaps. I tried to remind myself that this was normal. Ronan was never one for long conversations, and he hated these family events. But with every passing mile, the weight in my chest grew heavier. Pulling into my parents' driveway should lifted that weight. The familiar house, with its faded yellow paint and overflowing flower beds, always felt safe, no matter how old I got. But this time I don't know. Somehow it felt different. Maybe I'd just been holding on to too much hope that Ronan's mood would shift once we were with the others. He parked the car, stepped out, and shut the door behind him like it was just another obligation to check off his list. I followed, heart sinking deeper. As we entered through the front door, the burst of voices and laughter from the kitchen hit us instantly, the sound bouncing off the walls. I saw my cousins, aunts, uncles, all of them grinning, mid-conversation. The kind of easy warmth that I hadn't felt in months. Ronan's stiff posture beside me only made it all the more clear he didn't belong here today. Not like this. This. And yet this was my last chance to hope. I stepped out of the car, the warm summer air hitting my face as I took in the familiar sight of my family's estate. The reunion was already in full swing, laughter and chatter filling the air. My heart sank as I glanced at Ronan, his face set in that now familiar mask of indifference. Elora. A booming voice caught my attention. I turned to see my Uncle Heath striding towards me, his muscular frame cutting an imposing figure. He pulled me into a tight hug, his cologne overwhelming my senses. "Hey, beautiful," Owen's smooth voice chimed in as he appeared at my side, flashing me the $1,000,000 smile. "You're looking radiant as ever." I felt a blush creep up my cheeks. "Thanks, Owen. It's good to see you both." My eyes darted to the side where Ellis stood silently, observing the scene with his usual enigmatic expression. He gave me a small nod, which I returned with a weak smile. I turned, hoping to introduce Ronan, but he was already walking away, muttering something about getting the bags. My smile faltered as I watched his retreating back. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" Heath's gruff voice was tinged with concern. I plastered on a fake smile. "Of course, just a long drive, that's all." The evening rolled around, and we all gathered for dinner. The long table was laden with food, the aroma making my mouth water. But as I took my seat between Owen and Heath, my appetite vanished. Ronan was at the far end of the table, engrossed in his phone, barely acknowledging anyone. Owen leaned in close, his breath warm on my ear. "You look like you could use a drink." He poured me a generous glass of wine, his fingers brushing mine as he handed it over. I took a large sip, grateful for the distraction. "Thanks, Owen." As the night wore on, the wine flowed freely. My uncle's attention became more pointed, their compliments bolder. Heath's hand found its way to my knee under the table, and I was too numb to push it away. So I kept stealing glances at Ronan, desperately seeking some sign that he cared, that he noticed. But he remained distant, barely touching his food, his eyes never meeting mine. With each ignored look, each rebuffed attempt at connection, I felt myself slipping further away. The wine blurred the edges of my vision, and I found myself leaning into Owen's touch, laughing a little too loudly at Heath's jokes. So I slipped out the back door, the cool night air hitting my cheeks, reminding me I was still here, present. My head buzzed from the wine, too many glasses shared with faces I hadn't seen in far too long. But it was the loneliness that made me feel dizzy. The suffocating isolation of Ronan sitting across from me the whole evening, scrolling through his phone or staring into some distant space that had nothing to do with me. Like I didn't even exist. Exist. I leaned against the porch railing, letting the breeze play with strands of my hair. Everything felt heavier than it should. The weight of unspoken words, the ache in my chest, and the dull throb of guilt lurking at the edges of my drunken mind. I wasn't drunk enough, though. Not drunk enough to forget how much I missed being touched, missed being wanted. Wanted? Then Heath appeared. I didn't hear him approach. He stepped out from the shadows, holding a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid sloshing as he tilted it towards me in a sort of unspoken toast. "You all right out here?" His voice was low, rumbling like it always did. It had that razor edge underneath, sharp enough you couldn't quite ignore it. I didn't answer right away, just glanced over as he took a seat beside me on the porch steps. Sort of too close, but close enough to make my pulse quicken a little. I didn't know what I was doing, so I shouldn't have even been out there. Shouldn't have even cared that Ronan hadn't noticed I was gone for God knows how long. I gestured vaguely toward the house, taking a deep breath. Ronan's distant. Lately I just don't know how to reach him. It's like talking to a wall. The words tumbled out before I could stop them, slurred around the edges. Heath watched me carefully, his eyes sharp beneath the dim porch light. He always looked like he knew something I didn't. Marriage isn't easy. Sure as hell isn't what people expect it to be. He took a sip of his drink, his gaze never leaving me. There was something solid in Heath's energy. Not a single ounce of hesitation. A wolf sitting just that little bit too close. I should have known, maybe I did know. But I didn't move. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eyes, and I said more than I should have. I thought connections were supposed to get deeper over time. I thought, I don't know, maybe I'm the problem. My voice wavered with more vulnerability than I intended. Heath set his drink down on the porch with a slow, deliberate motion. For a beat, he didn't say anything. The silence thickened around us, the kind of tension that hummed in the air like static before a storm. "Doesn't sound like the problem's yours," he said after what felt like forever, his voice quieter now, rougher. His hand found my arm, sliding down slowly. It sent a jolt through me, sudden and electric. I should have pulled back. God, I should have done anything but freeze. But I didn't move, I couldn't move. Something both terrifying and thrilling. By the time we made it to the barn, my head was racing faster than my heart. The moment felt inevitable, like it had already happened before I even realized what I was doing. A moment later, there was just one thought. What the hell had I just done? I didn't speak. I couldn't. Every part of my body screamed for me to run, so I did. Back across the damp grass, my feet barely touching the ground, and back into the house where everything seemed too still, too quiet. I slipped back inside, tiptoeing toward the stairs. No one noticed me, not that anyone would. Ronan didn't stir when I opened the door to our bedroom, his back already turned to the door. The light from the hallway barely lit the outline of his body under the covers. It was ironic, really, the man I'd tried for so long to reach was right there within arm's length, and yet the distance between us now seemed even more unbearable, more permanent. I slid into the bed next to him, feeling as if I was sinking into quicksand. Lying there staring at the ceiling, I could still feel Heath's lips on mine, his hands on my skin. Everything felt wrong, jagged and razor-edged, cutting deeper with each passing second. I wanted to forget, wanted to erase the gnawing sense of disgust that crept in. But also, goddammit, there was adrenaline coursing through my veins. I clenched my eyes shut, willing sleep to come. But all I could hear was the soft buzz of Ronan's breathing, rhythmic and indifferent. So I don't know when I finally passed out, but the morning came too quickly. The sunlight streamed aggressively through the windows, intrusive and bright. So my head pounded, a reminder of the wine and whiskey that had fueled all the bad decisions of the night before. It hit me like a ton of bricks then. The weight of it. The sickening realization that what had happened couldn't be undone. Downstairs, the smell of coffee and eggs wafted through the air. Normal, domestic smells that felt so out of sync with everything swirling inside me. I forced myself to push through, to walk into the kitchen like everything wasn't falling apart. Heath was sitting at the table, sipping his coffee, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips like nothing had happened. No tension, no awkwardness. Just that same damn knowing look. But all I could do was avert my gaze, trying not to let him see the chaos raging beneath the surface. Ronan, of course, was half distracted by his phone, as always. He barely glanced up when I sat down across from him. already absorbed in some work email or whatever. "Morning," he said, without looking. Owen walked in next, flashing the easy grin he always wore. He took the seat next to me and leaned in, whispering in that half-annoying, half-charming tone he always used. "You look like you had fun last night. Too much wine?" I resisted rolling my eyes but couldn't help smiling just a little. At least with Owen I could forget for a minute. The conversation flowed easily, his wit quickly filling the silences Ronan kept leaving, but my mind kept flickering back to the barn, to Heath's touch, to the irreversible. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I found myself lying next to Ronan, listening to the rhythmic sound of his breathing, the same sound that had once comforted me but now just felt like another reminder of how far we drifted. The house had finally quieted down after the noise and chaos of the day. I stared up at the ceiling, searching for something, anything, that could pull me away from the regrets dancing around in my mind. I thought I was done for the night. That may be after what had happened with Heath. Well, maybe that was the end of it. But then I heard the soft creak of Owen's door as he stepped into the hallway. His footsteps hesitated outside our room, but they were light, more careful than I expected. Without even realizing what I was doing, I slipped out from under the sheets, moving as quietly as I could manage. So I didn't think too hard about it. If I had, I probably would have stayed in bed, forced myself to handle the guilt I was already drowning in. But instead, I opened the door just a fraction, enough to catch Owen's silhouette in the dim light of the hallway. "Ilara." His voice barely a whisper, but it tugged at something deep inside me, soft yet deliberate. He didn't say much else, he didn't have to. We didn't go far. His room wasn't too far down the hallway, far enough that no one would hear, but close enough for it all to feel like we were playing with fire, right under everyone's noses. The door clicked shut behind me, sealing the room in a layer of tension that was different than what I'd felt with Heath. Or when he wasn't Heath. He wasn't rough or demanding, and it just happened. For all Ronan's coldness, for all the distance between us, I couldn't shake the war between the guilt that gnawed at me and the strange sense of exhilaration pulsing through my veins. For here I was, sneaking around like some rebellious teenager, all while he lay in bed, oblivious. Or maybe he knew and just didn't care anymore. Maybe that was worse. And when I finally snuck back into our room, my heart was still racing from the thrill of it all. But it wasn't long before the shame started creeping back in. Ronan didn't stir, didn't even acknowledge my absence. There was no shift in the bed, no soft exhale of surprise, just the same endless silence. I'd grown used to that, the feeling of being invisible in my own marriage, but tonight it hit differently. Tonight it felt like permission. So I'm not sure how much time passed after that, but the next few days blurred together in a haze of awkward meals, carefully avoiding eye contact with Heath and Owen, and trying to pretend like everything was normal when it was anything but. The reunion, something I'd once looked forward to, had turned into a tightrope walk of secrets and lies. And of course, there was always the lingering fear at the back of my head that someone might have noticed. I wasn't exactly good at hiding myself. I never had been. What unsettled me most, though, was Ellis. He barely said a word during the dinners, just sat there at the corner of the table like some shadow lurking in the background. He had those eyes always watching in that quiet, calculated way that made my skin crawl. But it wasn't until one night, after another tension-filled meal, that I found him alone in the kitchen. I'd come down just to grab some water, hoping to have a few precious minutes to myself, when I saw him there, sitting in the dark like he'd been waiting for me. "Ilara," his voice low, but there was something different about it. It wasn't like Owen's deliberately sweet whispers or Heath's roughened charm. There was something darker there, something that prickled at the edges of my mind. I hadn't realized how close he'd gotten to me until his edges overlapped with mine, his deep brown eyes barely catching the dim light. It was like he'd calculated this moment, like he knew exactly what was going to happen, and I, stupidly, walked right into it. We didn't speak much. It's not like there was anything to really say. But somehow, before I even knew it, his hands were on me, and it wasn't comforting. There was something cold, clinical. But I didn't stop him. In that moment, I didn't even know how to. My mind felt clouded, like part of me detached and watched it all from a distance. When it was over, he just stood there, eyes locked on me in that unnerving, calculating way, as if to see what my next move would be. He didn't say anything, just looked at me with this knowing glance, like he'd peeled away part of me that I didn't even realize had been hidden. And then he slipped into the shadows, leaving me alone in that cold, dark room. I stood there for a while. I didn't cry. Didn't even feel the need to. The guilt, sure, that was there. But this was different. This left me raw, like something had been stripped away and I couldn't tell exactly what. Just that now it was gone. The ride back home with Ronan felt longer than usual. Each mile stretched out, the silence between us thick, heavier than anything I'd felt before. So I kept my hands in my lap, fingers fumbling with the hem of my jacket, my mind racing, trying not to meet his eyes. He didn't press me, just stared straight ahead, his grip firm on the steering wheel, his knuckles pale, like the rest of him. A part of me wondered if he always looked that cold or if it had gotten worse these past weeks. So that night, back in our house, I curled up on the couch, pretending to fall asleep while he disappeared into his office, like he always did. The house echoed the familiar loneliness. I thought about the reunion, about Heath, Owen, about Ellis. My stomach's twisted. Even thinking about that night with Ellis made something bitter rise in me, but there it was. It had happened. I couldn't erase any of it, and I sure as hell couldn't undo this, whatever this was growing inside me. The realization hit weeks later. I had missed another period, but part of me already knew before I saw the positive test. It was like my body had betrayed me in every way, carrying a reminder of everything that could never be taken back. The floor dropped out beneath me as I stared at that strip. Heath, Owen, or God, maybe even Ellis, or Ronan. I almost laughed at the thought, but there was no room for laughter in this mess. It couldn't be Ronan's. We hadn't been together in I couldn't even remember when. Some pitiful attempt months ago, if it even counted. So I didn't say anything at first, couldn't say anything. The shame of it all wrapped its fingers around my throat. I felt it every time I looked at Ronan, who seemed to somehow notice me again. He must be seeing the change in my body, the slight rounding of my belly, or maybe it was the way everything I did now carried this unshakable dread. So I wasn't the same. He wasn't an idiot, even if I'd convinced myself for a while that he was too distant to catch on. Ronan didn't ask, not directly, but he hovered, watched. There were moments, little things, like when he pretended he was just grabbing something from the kitchen, and I'd catch him glancing at me like he was figuring out a puzzle. I could feel him piecing it together in his mind, the doubts growing behind those blue eyes I'd once loved. He kept his distance still, but it was different now. It wasn't just cold indifference, it was suspicion. At first the visits felt innocent, or maybe I was just convincing myself they were. Heath, Owen, and Ellis started popping by more often once word of the pregnancy spread. I couldn't tell if it was actual concern or something darker, but it wasn't long before I figured it out. Every time one of them stepped foot into the house, the tension tightened like a noose. Heath, with his broad-shouldered stance and forced smile, would come by and sit in the kitchen with Ronan, making small talk about the baby and life, but his eyes never left me. Owen's inappropriate smirks and casual touches turned my stomach now, though I knew he was playing it off like nothing had ever happened between us. His charm, once magnetic, felt cheap and hollow now. And Ellis barely ever spoke even before everything, but now his silence felt outright threatening. The way he'd hover like he was observing or calculating something. His eyes, those deep-set brown pits, had become unbearable. They never outright said anything. No one dared mention the possibility aloud, the question that was hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Who was the father? I couldn't tell if they were scared or curious. Maybe both. Guilt. Nah, that didn't seem like something any of them would feel. But there was some weight they each carried when they were around me. A shadow behind their smiles as they checked in. I could feel their stares when I wasn't looking. Ronan, of course, noticed everything. He didn't say much, but I could feel his suspicion growing, layer by layer. He would sit at the head of the dining table, watching closely while I pretended things were normal between his uncles and me. He was quiet, but his eyes were starting to burn with a sharpness that wasn't there before. It terrified me, because for years his indifference was painful, but what scared me more now was the anger simmering under the surface. He didn't need to say anything. I could feel the change in him. His silence wasn't distant anymore. It was dangerous. I kept telling myself stupid lies just to get through the days. It's fine. They won't find out. Each visit was a reminder of the mess I created. What if Owen started wondering out loud? What if Heath took a drink too many and let something slip? And Ellis, I wasn't even sure what he was capable of anymore. And Ronan, always watching. Always putting the pieces together. One evening it came to a head. We were sitting in the living room, just Ronan and me. The TV was on, but neither of us was paying attention. I could feel Ronan's tension, coiled as tightly as a spring ready to snap. His jaw clenched, and he leaned forward like he was bracing for something, his fingers gripping the edge of his chair just a little too tightly. "When's the baby due?" His voice was low, calm, but there was no warmth in it. 3 months, I answered, trying to sound casual, trying to keep it all together. He didn't respond right away. He just stared at me, his blue eyes piercing. Then, out of nowhere, he hit me with it. Is it mine? Huh. My whole body went cold. My heart dropped to the pit of my stomach, and for a second I couldn't breathe. I wanted to say something, anything, but my mind was blank. Denny'd scream at him, anything to throw him off, but I could already see it in his eyes. He wasn't asking because he wanted reassurance. He was asking because he already knew the answer. I tried to muster indignation, shock, anything I could fake. What the hell are you talking about? My voice almost cracked, but I held it together enough. Barely. He didn't move, didn't flinch. You know exactly what I'm talking about. The accusation hung between us, and for the first time in a long time I felt something I hadn't with him: fear. Not the kind that comes from physical danger, but a deeper dread, a suffocating manic that crawled under my skin. His eyes were hard, unreadable now, but they bored into me like I was nothing more than a problem to be solved. But instead of pressing, he just stood up and left the room. Every inch of the house felt heavier after that. He didn't confront me again that night, but the way he closed the door to the bedroom, locked inside his own storm of thoughts, said enough. Each minute without him pressing the issue was unbearable because now he wasn't indifferent. He was pissed. So the next few weeks passed in a blur of frayed nerves and shallow breaths. But Ronan's coldness didn't disappear. That if anything, it solidified into something denser and more impenetrable. I felt like I was drowning in slow motion, weighted down every time one of the uncles came over. If having them around already made me feel like the walls were closing in, Ronan's next suggestion was the final nail. One morning, half-dressed and still knotting his tie, he said it. We'll do a test. Paternity. Like it was the most casual thing in the world. Like we were just talking about picking paint colors for the nursery. My hands fumbled around the stove, trying to act like I didn't hear him right. A test. We're going to find out for sure. Plain as day. I could feel him analyzing me, searching for the tiniest crack in my composure. My pulse raced, but I couldn't let him see it. I tried brushing it off. Oh, I don't know. Do we really need to do that? Aren't you overthinking this? His look, though. It was ice splintering across his face, slower than before, but just as deadly. I'm not overthinking anything. I want to know who the father is. The pit in my stomach expanded. I choked down the panic. I'd never felt trapped like this before. And even in my worst moments with Heath, Owen, or Ellis, this was worse. I knew that if that test happened, everything would come crashing down. She'd know. They'd all know. I tried delaying it. I said we could wait until after the baby is born, made up excuses about risks and doctors and being tired. But no matter what I threw at him, he didn't back down. Resolute, immovable. He wasn't buying my bullshit, and I was running out of options. The uncles noticed too. I could see it in their eyes with every glance they shot across the room during their visits. They didn't talk about the test, but there was something jittery under their smugness now. I remember hearing the baby's first cry, a sound so stark and raw it somehow felt like it cut straight through me. Well, it's nerdy. Well, you can take you. Hey, what? I thought maybe for a tiny second, when I handed Ronan the newborn, there would be some flicker, some sign of softness. But he just stood there, stiff, arms folded tight across his chest. His eyes were on the baby, but it was like he saw right through it. He didn't even reach out. He just pressed his lips in that cold, familiar line, then turned away. It wasn't just rejection. It was like watching something inside him snap. The baby, the one clue to everything, lay there in my arms while my husband, the man I thought I'd spend forever trying to fix things with, drifted further away. A shattered doesn't begin to explain what I felt. Or maybe I didn't feel it all in those moments. Maybe I'd already numbed myself. Hours passed in a blur of nurses, check-ins, and the parade of visitors. They came. Heath, Owen, Ellis. Each of them showing up at different moments, their faces doing all the talking they weren't brave enough to say out loud. Heath glanced over the baby, then shot me a quick look. His eyes darted away before I could even register what the fuck he'd seen. Owen, of course, put on that smile, though it faltered the second his gaze landed on the newborn's face. And Ellis? Well, he just stared, unspeaking, barely moving, face as unreadable as a storm cloud hanging overhead, waiting to burst. None of them stayed more than a few minutes. None of them lingered or commented, or acted like a proud relative seeing a new addition to the family. It was as though an invisible bomb had gone off, and we were all just standing there amidst the wreckage, trying to figure out what the hell to do next. I swear their silence was suffocating. It clung to the air like humidity, the tension building with every second they stood in that room. I could see it, feel it, the searching stares, the quick, nervous glances between me and the baby, and it made my skin crawl. God, I don't even remember if I said anything. I think Owen asked something mundane, like was the labor rough, as if pretending everything was normal might somehow make it normal. It was bullshit, all of it. The words, the half-assed glances, the mounting unease. Everyone was chasing something they were too scared to say out loud. By the time Ronan left, later that night, things had gone silent. Like the calm before a tornado, right before everything gets ripped out of place. He didn't say shit, just grabbed his bags, shoved his clothes into them, mechanical and emotionless. At some point, I opened my mouth to say something. I don't even know what. My throat just closed up, and I remember the thick weight pressing against my chest. My words didn't matter. Ronan's back was already to me. The door clicked shut behind him without even a goddamn glance back at me or our baby. But his absence practically screamed the truth. The DNA test had arrived. The results were in. He hadn't needed to fucking spell it out. His silence said more than any outburst could. When I opened the envelope, alone in the kitchen after another sleepless night, my hands barely shook. Somewhere in my gut I already knew. I had known for months now, hadn't I? I just hadn't wanted to know. Like some childish part of me thought, that if I didn't actually see the truth spelled out in DNA, I could keep pretending. But there it was. Not his, not Ronan's. So the reality slid down, bitter and cold like a bad drink, and with it any hope I'd had at clinging to some version of normal life. And what did Heath do about it? What did Owen say? What did Ellis, that fucking cryptic son of a bitch, contribute now? Nothing. Not a damn word. They all slithered back into their lives after the birth, retreating into their own corners, so there was no confrontation. No raised voices about whose kid it was. I waited, unaware of whether I was hoping or dreading one of them might show up and try to own responsibility, or support, or anything. But of course they didn't. It's not in their nature to own up to things they can hide behind polite smiles and fading distance. Ellis, he'd always been a ghost in the family there, but not really there, and he just played into his disappearing act even more. I hadn't seen him since the hospital. Heath and Owen still made the occasional appearance, but the tension had shifted. It was this awkward thing that hung there, just waiting. Their visits would get shorter and shorter until, eventually, they wouldn't even bother anymore. To Ronan. Simon. He didn't call. He didn't show up. Didn't even send a text asking about the baby or how we were doing. I mean, why would he? The proof, the ultimate betrayal, stared him in the face every goddamn time he thought about it. I'm sure he'd already filed for divorce. Hell, he probably wanted to burn the entire concept of me from his memory. The Ronan I knew, his coldness, his detachment, had imploded into a void that I couldn't reach across anymore, even if I tried. I stood in front of the crib some nights, watching the baby sleep. Such innocence, so unaware of the chaos swirling around his existence. Sometimes I'd just stare exhausted, trying to search for any hint of which one of them it looked like. It's ridiculous grasping at any stray feature, trying to make sense of something that didn't actually make sense. The truth was, it didn't matter. Baby or not, it was all a mess I had created, and now I was left in a void I hadn't even anticipated. The pile of Ronan's abandoned things by the door hadn't budged since he stormed out. I didn't have the energy to touch them. Let them sit there like a monument to everything that crumbled around me. Every shirt, every jacket, a piece of proof that someone had once stayed.